Hiya, it's me again, back in my quiet spot. It's been a while since I made a video, but I only like to do them when I've got something really to talk about, and this should be interesting. As you know, my previous videos, they were connected with A Brave New World and Aldous Huxley, and this ties into it, because as you may or may not know, in A Brave New World it was a scientific dictatorship, and people who were mostly clones in the lower classes and the upper classes, they had the right to pass on their eggs and sperm, and they were donors, I think, as well as having natural births. They were donors to the clones that made the clones. And I think that there is a drug amongst our society right now that is or could play a vital role in the reality of a brave new world. It's been kind of low-key in the past, up into about the year 2000. This may be controversial to some people. Most of my videos maybe are. And I don't mean to stereotype or put down certain people. But the title of this video is Steroids and A Brave New World. Now, I'm mainly talking about anabolic steroids, but sex hormones in general, really. Now, anabolic steroids really were, I reckon, pretty much low-key up into the mid-2000s, do you think? When I say that, I mean their main use was for bodybuilding and professional bodybuilding, anabolic steroids. I've done a little bit of research on this. I mean, the bodybuilders in the 80s, 70s, 60s, and going back probably into the 50s, they were a closely knit group of people. There weren't very many of them. Bodybuilding was considered very strange, odd. It wasn't popular at all, so according to what I've heard, these guys would train into a gym, they train in a gym, they would train hard, they would release a lot of their genetic potential, and then they would get into a group, a small clique of people that knew how to get hold of this stuff, and then they would be introduced to it if they were physically advanced enough and if they wanted to compete. And that's just what it was used for. Now, I think, compared to then, steroids have become mainstream for men. Your competitive bodybuilder doesn't just use them, it's your average guy in the office that wants a better physique, that wants to look good on the beach, that wants to look good naked. A lot of these people are taking them. So it's introduced into the mainstream, it's becoming slowly more acceptable for people. But why is that? Because most people will argue, well, it's for guys that want to build better bodies. Well, the pill was introduced for women in the 60s, and they were told it was for feminism and independence, but I think there's a different agenda there as well. The same for steroids. So, in a scientific dictatorship, you would have the state decide whether you reproduce or not. You would have to prove that you're good enough for them, you're submissive enough, and now, but if you could already do that, if you could already reproduce, then you wouldn't need to, would you? And this connects to something else as well. All of the artificial chemicals that have been put into products, mainly in plastics. The main one is, I believe, is bisphenol A, and it's put into cosmetic makeups for women, and this lowers men's testosterone. It helps block it or lower it. It lowers our sperm count, fertility, and stops us being fully functional men. And apparently we have been bombarded with this stuff for decades. I mean, nearly over 100 years or 100 years. So we maybe now are seeing the repercussions of it, because they say that men's sperm counts are plummeting. That's European men mainly. Another thing that this can tie into is this whole transgender agenda. because these people may, not all of them, I mean, some argue that they're mentally confused, but they probably are, because if this is a case of chemical manipulation, then they feel they're neither male nor female because of the damage that's been done to their hormones. At the same time, the mainstream media is saying that there's no such thing as a gender, that people can choose their own sex. The whole gender thing is an illusion, which is a load of rubbish because it's biologically proven. Otherwise they're saying that science and evolution, that what we're taught at school, doesn't make sense. So, yeah, a child can choose their sex, and the adults can decide to put their child for a sex change on the NHS. The NHS is paying for this. There's absolutely no problem with that. But what do you need for a sex change? Apart from being castrated and having your genitals made to look like those of the opposite sex, what else do you need? You need hormones. Because you don't have your own. If you're having a sex change, you need the opposite hormone, so it's got to be done synthetically. So steroids, basically, you need steroids. In a very long-winded series of videos I did for several hours, I spoke on a book written by one of the Huxley brothers. I think it was called The Impact of Science on Society, and they were openly talking about the experiments they did on animals, and one that rings a bell was the experiment they did with tadpoles, I think, and they cut out their pituitary gland, or one of those glands, I think it's a pituitary gland, and they fed it back to them in controlled doses. And what they found is if they fed them the full dose, I believe they would grow into a normal frog. They would go through that natural metamorphosis. But if they cut the dose, they could kind of leave them in between the stage, so they could leave them half developed, and then they wouldn't grow anymore. So they realised that they can have absolute control over these subjects' hormones and in regulating them. That is very key, because this book ultimately was talking about how we can do this to human subjects in order to have a scientific dictatorship. And that is absolute key. I've got my notes here, so as a in a scientific government, you would control hormones, and this not only would shape the behaviour of people, but it would decide whether or not they are going to be in this world or not, if they're going to reproduce. So, I think that steroids, in the end, anabolic steroids right now, really is kind of a shady subject. It's much like marijuana. You can have them for your own private purposes, but you can't supply them. So it's a grey area, really. It's not really illegal. I mean, some countries you can get them from a doctor. I'm sure in Thailand you can just go over, in places you can just buy them over the counter. You can buy them heaps of stuff. Here in the UK it's a lot more difficult than in other countries. And obviously, if you're caught supplying them, it's definitely a criminal offence. But I think that